Ladies and gentlemen, on a day where Russia is buzzing our own borders, I think it is imperative that we debate the motion that this House is extent on building an empire, even if we conclude that it's probably not going to involve Cornwall. I first would like to introduce the opposition. In the first opposition, we have the Honourable Oliver Key, the current member of the Secretaries Committee and an undergraduate at St. Peter's College reading Russian, Czech and Slovak. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Adam Swain, an Associate Professor of Economic Geography at Nottingham University, focusing on the geography of post-Soviet Europe and particularly Ukraine. And finally, we have Orlando Figues, an internationally renowned historian and an author of A People's Tragedy, The Whispers, and Natasha's Dance, among other works on Russian history and culture, and a prominent critic of Putin's involvement in the school curricula, including his attempts to rehabilitate Stalin in historical memory. Ladies and gentlemen, these are your opposition, and they are most welcome. Now to the motion of the debate. Putin has always been a leader with an incredible public standing. The cult of Putin is a phenomenon well known in Russia. Last year, his approval ratings hit 85%, numbers unknown for Western politicians. And he was named Russia's Man of the Year for the 15th year in a row. Incredible. An example of his cult of popularity is his lavish birthday celebrations. In particular, his 50th birthday celebrations in 2002 brought a number of tributes from across the lands. Possibly the most memorable was from a former deputy prime minister of Bashkortostan, who wrote a 3-page ode that consisted exclusively of words beginning with the letter P, and concluded with the assurance that "Po planecie postawiać pamiętniki pierwszemu prezydentu planetu Putin." All around the planet, they will put up monuments to the first president of the planet, Putin. Almost 15 years later, Putin seems more concerned than ever with ensuring that he will be the first president of maybe not the whole planet, but a significantly larger Russian-controlled area than the one he initially inherited from Boris Yeltsin. I therefore believe that Putin is building an empire in two main senses. Firstly, in the definition of an empire as an extensive group of states, of countries ruled over by a single sovereign state, and secondly, in the understanding of an empire as the subordinate of other states to a single state. I will explain. But first, let me deal with quite a lot of awkward math paper. Firstly, in the definition of an empire as an extensive group of states, or countries ruled over by a single state. This is clear in the literal sense. Putin has literally taken parts of other countries. We have seen the forcible annexation of Crimea and the occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine. There are a lot of Russian soldiers that seem to have gotten very lost in the border areas recently, but luckily they're checking in on Instagram to make sure that we know where they are. Not for the first time, this is not the first time that Russia has been involved in separatist conflicts to its own benefit. Abkhazia and South Ossetia may not have resulted in parts of other countries forming literal parts of Russia, but they were Russian involvement in states that then gained de facto independence to Russia's benefit. To that extent, they are taking areas from another sovereign state, in that case Georgia, and making them into Russian dependencies or pro-Russian bodies. This doesn't seem likely to stop. Russia is actively militarizing. They are modernizing their conventional forces, they are modernizing their nuclear forces, and they are testing NATO. We've currently seen Bear bombers flying close to UK and European airspace, including today, ladies and gentlemen. The defense minister, Michael Fallon, said that we have a real and present danger of Russia trying to destabilize the Baltic states, where 40% of the state is often ethnically Russian. This imperialist rhetoric coming from Putin, claiming that all these parts of former Soviet lands kind of belong to Russia, particularly where there are Russians involved. No, thank you. It's coming out of the Kremlin. And what we can see here is that this imperialist rhetoric is not showing a sign of going away. Putin's not interested in losing these groups, losing any influence over these countries. Instead, he's looking forward to gaining it. As well as the literal seizing of states, there have also been attempts to create Russian-dominated spheres of interest in the near abroad. While former Soviet states have been allowed to establish relations with other international players, such as the West or China, this has its limits. Georgia joining NATO and Ukraine getting closer to the EU were not okay in the eyes of Putin. Essential parts of the Russian sphere of influence have not been allowed to move very far abroad. While Ukraine can have its little trade relations, or Georgia can, sign the Partnership for Peace, they can't actually move away from Russia. That's not all right. Any inducement from outsiders, such as cooperation with the West, is merely temporary and at Russia's convenience. Russia needed the West to help them keep out terrorist activities from Afghanistan. But that was very much portrayed as, we'll let them come in and help sort out the terrorists, and then they're going to leave again. Don't worry, it's all that they're cooperating with Russia. Yeah.
You've given us lots of examples of places that Russia's literally fought over for hundreds of years, but do you have any proof that Putin is doing anything different?
The rhetoric coming out of Putin is different than ever before. If you look at the rhetoric under Yeltsin, he actively said, Russians living abroad can choose to be part of other countries. That's okay. And people who are non-Russian living in Russia can choose to be Russian. We think that's lovely. Putin's rhetoric is slightly different, ladies and gentlemen. He believes that Russians outside of Russia are actively his property that he seems to be able to control. Suddenly, Crimea is not like, oh, you can choose to be Ukrainian or you can choose to be Russian. No, thank you. I will just get on with my speech. But suddenly, that these are integral parts of the Russian state. In general, he's made it clear that certain countries are under his sphere of influence, in particular Ukraine, which is involved as an integral part of the Russian state. For example, the Eurasian Customs Union is an example of this is the Eurasian Customs Union, where he's literally trying to form a Russian-controlled sphere of influence, including Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. He's suggesting this as a rival to the EU. As Russian markets are a lot less profitable than the EU markets are to these states, he's essentially strong-arming countries into the Union which need his help. And I'm going to explain that later when I talk onto my second point of how Russia is building an empire. But by creating these huge Russian spheres of influence, he is essentially ensuring Russian command over a group of countries. He's also extending his influence through multiple forms by propping up authoritarian regimes. For example, Uzbekistan, which has an authoritarian regime, where the US asked them to reform and the US asked them to allow international monitors to look at their human rights abuses, Russia was like, if you side with us, you don't have to do that. You just kind of have to do what we say instead. Uzbekistan's rulers thought that seemed all right, and so they gain influence in this way. In many areas, you still have the post-Soviet leadership. And in many of the Central Asian states, still the presidents were the first Soviet secretaries. Like, there is this command that he has over his sphere of influence that he's not willing to give up. He's also reaching out to the diaspora as part of a larger Russia. The Russian diaspora is traditionally passive. Unlike the Jewish diaspora, there aren't these huge agitative groups or any kind of pro-interest groups. Instead, he's trying to motivate them. He's emphasizing their links with Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church is coming back out and saying that how they have this, they share these interests with Russia and they should feel Russian. And in the most extreme case of this is, of course, Crimea, where he's used the Russian diaspora essentially to gain part of another country. The idea that Putin is trying to ensure Russian control over an extensive group of countries is the creation of an empire, ladies and gentlemen. Countries in the Russian sphere of influence are not free to act as they please. As can be shown in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Georgia, that Russia will shut off their gas, they will restrict their visa regimes, and they will, as a last resort, actually invade their countries. This is not freedom, this is not sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen. This is control, and this is an empire. Secondly, in the understanding of an empire is the subordination of other states to a single state. There is some debate in the scholarship over whether the USSR was really an empire because of the multinational nature of it. Countries were regarded as relatively equal, and a lot of countries were represented in the main government in Moscow. It wasn't that there was the British Empire and there were the countries that it owned. It was one big multinational state. Now, however, the states in these groups are subordinate to Moscow. For example, if we look at the customs union, how much power does anyone think Armenia actually has in the customs union, ladies and gentlemen? States cannot leave. Yes?
Armenian citizens are the only citizens who can become Russian citizens without denying their Armenian citizenship. My mother is Ukrainian, my father is Russian, and actually I'm waiting for the Green government to send me a conscription letter saying I have to turn up as a military service. Now, 2 weeks ago I was in the Russian embassy applying for Russian citizenship, and the Russian consul said to me, if you want as a Russian native speaker, yes, you can be a Russian citizen, but in order to do that, I have to renounce my British citizenship. Now, I'm very jealous of the Armenian citizens who can actually become Russian citizens without having to deny their Armenian identity. So how is this?
Okay. Actually, the Russian government is currently introducing a law which means that no one will be able to have dual citizenship. And it is Russian policy that if you now want to be Russian, whereas frequently you could have dual citizenship, if you want to be Russian now, you have to be able to renounce all of your other citizenships to prove your loyalty to the main state. Armenia doesn't really have a say in the customs union, right? If Armenia is like, I really think we should change the terms of policy, do you think the Kremlin's really going to listen? It's a country of 3 million people. Moscow has effectively strong-armed in states that are dependent and acts to keep them that way. For Armenia, this is interests of security. They're fighting a war with Azerbaijan, which is a frozen conflict. Russia likes to keep them afraid of Azerbaijan by selling arms to Azerbaijan, but Russia also guarantees Armenian security, so they can't really do anything about it. Kazakhstan relies on the economic infrastructure links it has with Russia. Belarus is economically dependent. All of these countries rely on Russian oil, and it strong-arms them into these agreements that force them to give up agreements with the EU and force them to give up agreements with the US. None of these states have a real say against Russia, and Russia is acting to control more and more of their policies and freedoms. Even if it's not the classical version of an empire with marauding armies and Genghis Khan spreading his way across the fields, it is still an empire in the fact that these states don't get a say. They are being controlled by an external state, and their interests are subordinate to the capital of an external state. Ladies and gentlemen, this imperialist rhetoric is not going away. The Russian army is only getting larger, and the states nearby should do well to worry because Putin is building an empire.